Well, I've been asked to come today to talk a little bit about social media, and I just first want to say, this is not going to feel remotely reassuring, but I actually have no idea what you should do in your families. And I don't mean that I'm not going to give you some guidance today and create some awareness for what you need or should be thinking about as it pertains to social media in your homes. But each of you have kids that are different. Each of you have different values in your home. Each of you have different expectations about connection, about risk. And so I just like to say when I do a talk like this, like, take what you like and leave the rest. This is not a you should lecture, it's a awareness lecture to sort of help you think about in your home what might be some pitfalls to being consistent in your parenting when it comes to social media, and also some things that you may or may not know about what's currently available to our kids. I think both my kids are 20 and almost 23 and 21, and if I knew then what I know now about social media, my rules would have been different, but I also, as this landscape has been evolving and will continue to evolve in a meaningful way, the rules are going to be different even in a week or a month. And so it's more about thinking, taking a perspective on how you want to attack some of these high-risk times in our kids' lives so that you can feel more confident and create better connection with your kids. Because social media is not going anywhere for sure. It's an ecosystem that we really do need to learn how to live well with. Okay, so let's first talk, just for giggles, about middle school brains, okay? So middle school children are at this very unique stage of development where they're navigating this transition from childhood to adulthood, which I know is not news to most of you. And several factors of their identity formation really do contribute to their vulnerability in the context of social media. So they are really in the process of forming their identity, how they attach or relate to other kids, and they may be more susceptible to the influence of social media in shaping their self-perception and also their self-worth. They also, they also are developing a sense of peer pressure, right? That relationships and peer relationships become increasingly significant as our kids navigate middle school and high school, and particularly related to how they seek validation from other kids. This is a very normal developmental milestone, something that as adults we don't always grow out of. But children may feel pressured in this age group to conform to social norms or engage in risky behaviors online to fit in with other peers. And sometimes they'll have FOMO, and that can sometimes drive excessive social media as they strive to stay connected with kids their age. Children also have, in this age group, limited self-regulation. That's also a developmental norm. They are still developing all of those skills, including impulse control and appropriate decision-making. And so they may be more prone to engaging in impulsive or risky behaviors online, like sharing personal information inadvertently or on purpose without thinking of the consequences. Sometimes they're participating in online challenges or interacting with strangers that they don't know without fully understanding the potential consequences. And again, there's nothing wrong with your kid if that's the problem. That is where they are developmentally in their brains. And it's really critical when you think about your middle schoolers to see them through that lens. It's almost like you would never expect your kindergartner to read Harry Potter. Like, they don't have the developmental skills at this point to sometimes navigate social media, but most of them think they do, okay? They also have a really significant desire for independence. So middle schools are often seeking independence from you, and that sometimes can make it even more challenging for you to help them navigate the social media landscape. And balancing their need for autonomy, which I was asked about and we'll get to later, and supervision is really critical, and it's admittedly difficult, and it's different for every kid depending on the kind of child you have. I have one child with very high executive functioning and another who would have been very vulnerable to making mistakes online. And had I had more substantial rules in the time when they probably needed it, I would have had to parent them differently. And that might be true for those of you who have more than one child as well. And that's okay. And then finally, middle schoolers are developing kind of this really significant cognitive rewiring at this age. And I like to think about it like they're operating from the part of their brain that is not particularly smart. So they are smart, but They're operating from their lower brain, okay? And so when I think about the brain, I like think about it on my wrist, and our lower brain is kind of like our fight or flight, kind of the place where we're just kind of doing and not really thinking. And then our frontal lobe kind of folds over that and stays online and helps us to use all of the kind of executive functioning skills that help most of us be effective adults. And our kids' frontal lobes not only are often offline because they're just crazy town, but they also don't have a well-developed frontal lobe that doesn't typically get fully finished until the age of 26. And so the expectations we often have of our kids to think and plan and problem solve and remember and think about a situation ahead of time are simply skills that they don't have at this age. And so it's critical that we remember that piece at the risk of sounding redundant. And studies also indicate that not only is this an issue, but that chronic social media use and online use can also interfere with the growth of their planning and processing and frontal lobe maturation. So, how many hours does the typical American child spend on social media? Research conducted by Common Sense Media in 2019, which is not the latest data, found that on average, American teens spend about 7 hours, almost 7.5 hours per day on screens for entertainment, which includes social media, gaming, and watching videos. And according to a 2023 survey conducted in the United States, teenagers spend an average of 4.8 hours on social media platforms. Overall, girls spend an hour more than boys a day, with an average of about 5.5 hours compared to about 4.5 for boys. In general, boys spend more time on YouTube, and girls, obviously, the most used platform is either Snapchat or TikTok. I like to think about sort of how this rewiring and this generation has kind of evolved, how we got to this place. And I just want to remind all of you that we didn't get the iPhone until 2007. The App Store came shortly thereafter, which was in about 2008. And then it was the following year when Facebook started the like button, when Twitter started giving you the capacity to retweet, and we also started to get push notifications, which greatly changed the ecosystem in the social media world. Of course, the front camera in 2010 changed everything, especially for our teenagers, as they started to navigate that, take pictures and selfies of themselves, and then that translated into Instagram, which came around in 2012. And in 2013, 5 short years after the app stores began, we had almost 1 million apps online.
What?
And then in 2015, on average, about 70% of teens have a smartphone. And I'd say that was closer to 85-90% when you were this age as well. So just to understand how social media platforms work, and let's just be clear, like don't ask me 1,000 questions about that, I'm no social media expert. But what I will say is that it's nice to know kind of what the different parameters are in social media networks and why they influence our kids in certain ways. So social media platforms typically have 4 things, especially the ones that our kids are currently using. There's a user profile where we share information with people. There is a user-generated content where we can text, where we can share videos and links and post. There's a networking system like we see with Facebook or LinkedIn, right, where we can sort of connect with other people. And then there's an interactivity component where we can like and comment and share and DM. And most of the platforms that our kids use have all 4 of these things. But just so we're on the same page, the most common things that kids use are the following 4 platforms, which I'm sure won't be rocket science to any of you. TikTok, which has experienced, as you know, explosive growth in recent years, particularly among younger demographics, including middle schoolers. And it is the short form video platform where users can create and share information and entertaining videos set to music. They can do challenges on TikTok and discover content that's tailored to their interests. YouTube, and it's particularly common in kids in our age group, ages 11, 13. You're fine, hi. In the age group of our kids in middle school. Snapchat is known for its disappearing messages, as well you well know, And it's very popular among younger users who seem to value privacy and also spontaneity. I mean, I do not understand Snapchat. If I watch my kid take some weird picture of himself one more time and send it to their friend with no words, and every time I'm like, why? Why is that a thing? But what I also will say about Snapchat is that I didn't comment on, is that it also creates the availability for kids to find each other, to see each other in different locations, and send videos, content and messages to their friends. And they also, of course, can explore, like on TikTok and YouTube content creators. YouTube remains the go-to platform for middle schoolers who seek entertainment. Sometimes they're learning, education-wise, and inspiration. They use YouTube to watch videos on a wide range of topics, from gaming to comedy to tutorials, sometimes vlogs. Maybe some of your kids have used them to learn how to do something. And they also can create and share their content, which for some entrepreneurial kids has been a fabulous way for them to start to expand their creative message in the world. And then Instagram is wildly popular among middle schoolers for its focus on visual content, such as photos and short videos. It also, as you know, offers direct messaging, stories, reels, and they can share moments from their lives. And Instagram, probably in addition, as now equally as close to TikTok, kids can access influencers and kids in their age group that promote certain topics that may be relevant to them, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's really essential for as a parent or an educator or a caregiver, for you all to stay informed about what all these social media platforms do. And I know as a parent myself, I found that landscape to be particularly overwhelming, and they didn't have, when my kids were younger, the kind of information they currently have to better understand the risks and how they work that they do now. And probably one of the best places for you to use as a resource, not only to educate yourself, but to engage in conversations with your kids about online safety and responsible use, and frankly just digital literacy, is commonsense.org, which some of you may know, but that's probably my favorite place to get resources and available information for you all to help to navigate this with your teens. And it is just chock full of tons of information. It's fabulous. So today I want to talk a little bit about the mental health costs of social media. The worst time for kids to be on social media, according to the current data, is middle school, specifically related to our girls between 11 and 13, boys a teeny bit older. And I will say, for what it's worth, that I think I'd be remiss if I didn't comment that, you know, there certainly are some positive and negative things about social media. I mean, certainly it's a context-dependent, sort of nuanced perspective. And I will say that it is not a matter of opinion that social media is worse for girls than for boys, at least in the current landscape now. It's well known that they're more oriented to relationships, and whether that changes or not in the next decade, I can't say, but boys typically are more active in gaming than they are connecting online, and that creates a special vulnerability for our girls that I think is worth commenting on, and I'll comment more on in a minute. So certainly some of the positive aspects of social media are that they can facilitate connections, right? That's how we started using it as parents, and probably still do, with family and friends and communities. It's specifically quite lovely for kids who may feel marginalized or isolated in their offline lives. It sometimes can create an online support group and community for kids who are struggling with mental health issues, gender identity, places where there's not a space for them to feel the same at a time when that's so important to them in middle school. Additionally, it's a great place where we can get information and awareness that we didn't know about mental health issues, about offering coping strategies, opportunities for education, for advocacy, and many mental health organizations specifically use social media to create awareness in a really compelling way for our kids to understand it, especially if you come from a family of a group of parents who aren't comfortable having difficult conversations. Many of our kids will use social media as a place to get that information. And then finally, it's a fabulous place for expression and creativity, as I alluded to earlier when I was talking about YouTube. So there are opportunities for being not only expressing yourself, but for self-discovery through activities like sharing your artwork or writing or music or personal stories. Sadly, the data, though, really does not support that the positives outweigh the negatives. So I'm going to share with you some obvious and less obvious negatives that I think are important that you pay attention to. Social media, even in adults, can foster a culture of comparison and unrealistic expectations, where we all compare our lives and our experiences and our achievements to what's often a kind of curated and idealized representation of what isn't true. And I know that that's not news to any of you. One of my favorite things about being a pediatrician at the time was I was friends with a lot of my patients on Facebook, and I could be in the office with a parent struggling with something and knowing what was true, and then seeing them post where they were an hour later and knowing that it wasn't. And even though I wasn't happy for them about that, and I feel it's painful to think that they couldn't put what was really happening in their lives, it really did help me in real time always know that what we're seeing online is often not what we're seeing behind the scenes. And we know by now that this creates an unrealistic standard of beauty and success and popularity on social media platforms that really can exacerbate our middle schoolers' feelings of normal inadequacy and need to connect. And so this really worsened in 2010 when the front camera began and Instagram started. And that was really the beginning of a very big shift in mental health for our kids, in my opinion. Obviously, too, cyberbullying and online harassment are significant concerns on social media platforms as well. And, that includes what we're already seeing in terms of trolling and hate speech for those of you who are in marginalized communities in your own home, in your own lives. That's something that our kids and we see on the regular. And the part that really makes it even more detrimental is that the anonymity and the distance that's afforded by these platforms can amplify the effect of so many of these behaviors, especially when our kids don't have the logic or the capacity to really digest the information with their frontal lobe. Validation seeking, as I mentioned, is much worse for girls. So the quest for likes and comments and followers on social media can create a cycle of seeking external validation and approval, which obviously can negatively impact self-esteem and self-worth. And then, we're seeing this all the time in the political landscape, but our kids are also getting a curated, feed of the things that they pay attention to, and the social media companies do this with intention, that creates a filter bubble and an echo chamber that prioritizes content that aligns with their preferences and beliefs. And so not only can that reinforce biases and polarized viewpoints, but especially at a school like CA where we're really trying to increase diversity and teach people about different perspectives, the more time we allow, especially our middle schoolers, to stay online, it interferes with their capacity to really see more than one point of view. And that's, I think, not every kid gets lucky enough to come to the school, but that's a really important place where there can be a disconnect in our kids if we're not careful. Additionally, a lot of these filter bubbles can create more significant feelings of isolation in our teens and disconnection from reality. One thing that I also think is interesting to explore, and you might not agree with, but a lot of these social media platforms that have kids who are willing to share their mental health struggles, for example, or their gender preferences, for example, really create this really marvelous place where kids can be seen and feel like they belong in places where they're marginalized, as I mentioned before, or they might not feel they fit in. But the other thing that those, what we're seeing is that the other things that those places do is sometimes create a reality that doesn't exist for our kids. They start to see, there was one really interesting article about in a neurology journal that we were starting to see a really significant increase in tic disorders, like when you do like a motor tic. And there was some social media TikTok star who had Tourette's, and they were seeing an exponential increase in these kids who were having tic disorders that were like the social media star. I think that happens with anxiety. I think it happens with depression. depression. I think it happens with gender fluidity. I'm not implying that those things aren't real or that they're not worth believing, but I think when we start to see that placed over and over again, that can be a place of belonging where kids identify and therefore can sometimes magnify issues that may not be there or that they don't really understand how to navigate. And girls are clearly more vulnerable to this than boys are. And then there's porn. So I want to talk briefly about porn because I don't think we talk enough about that. Most parents are surprised to know how significant porn is in your kids' lives. And I want to be super clear about it in case there's any ambiguity. Research indicates that boys are more likely than girls to report exposure to pornography during adolescence, although the gender gap may be narrowing on that. And exact figures on pornography vary, but surveys have indicated that there's anywhere from 25 to 70% of kids that have been exposed to pornography online, and most of the time that begins in middle school. Studies have found that the average age of first exposure to pornography ranges from 11 to 14. The odds of one of you or many of your kids not seeing porn if you allow them on your internet are very low, very low. And pornography has a lot of effects, obviously, but exposure during adolescence can influence their attitudes and behaviors related to sexuality. Some studies have indicated a correlation between exposure to pornography and beliefs that trivialize sexual violence. We spend a lot of time worrying about Fortnite and guns, but we don't think a whole lot about just sort of the exposure our kids can have when we're not knowing what they're doing. And they can obviously get unrealistic expectations about sex, about relationships, about expectations of partners, about what normal sex looks like. If we're not already talking about sex in our homes, which I think is so important, that can be their first introduction to what that looks like for them. And it sometimes can also have negative outcomes related to depression, low self-esteem, and shame. So many kids look up stuff just for curiosity, and then they get something online that they don't know what to do with. And because they know they're going to get in trouble because it's something that's prohibited, they don't share it, they carry it, and oftentimes that festers and can look like shame. It's super common. Many adolescents report that their parents are completely unaware of their exposure to pornography or have not discussed the topic with them at all. So I do really recommend that you get comfortable with open and honest communication about pornography and not just what not to do. We talk all the time with our kids, don't do this, don't do drugs, don't smoke, don't all the things. And then what happens is they get themselves in situations and they don't know what to do. When you're in a situation where all your friends are doing something, what will you do? When you're in a situation and you see pornography online, how will you handle that? When one of your friends tells you that they're hurting themselves, what will you say? I think it's so much more powerful for our teens to equip them with what to do in situations that they might get into, instead of asking them how to avoid them. It doesn't set them up for any scaffolding on how to handle the very real situations that are going to come their way, even at a fancy school like this. So it turns out, for the most part, teen mental health is on us. The industry in general is designed on purpose to keep our kids connected to it, and it is not going anywhere. So, if you think about our kids' childhoods, like they're living in just the most bizarre time. They don't play outside. They don't have the freedom to, when they do play outside, they're doing an organized sport where they can't make their own rules, where there are the same age group of people, so they can't navigate different age groups and understand different facets of leadership, how to take care of younger kids, how to pay attention to older. They don't have a lot of risk of physical discomfort, right? Risk is a critical part of play. That's an important way that our kids start to develop parts of their brains that navigate the world. And we really started believing at some point in the last 10 to 15 years that minimizing our kids' risk in the real world equals good parenting because we're afraid. And it really is a very powerful way that we block our children's growth. It turns out that I was pretty lucky that I was giving this talk right around the time that this new book came out, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, which I have read, and I would encourage you to read. But he artfully discusses 4 foundational harms for social media that I think is worth discussing in the context of this conversation, so that you can start to think about your boundaries with this lens. He also says something beautiful that, we spend so much time creating lots of risk-related boundaries for our kids in the real world, and we have very limited boundaries or inconsistent boundaries for our kids to navigate the social media landscape. And the truth is that the creeps are not outside, they're online now. It's not the same as when we were kids. So first, let's talk about the first harm of social media for our kids, which is social deprivation. So our kids crave and need synchronous relationships, okay? When online relationships are not the same, they're more negotiable. So when I'm watching you and we're taking this talk together and I can see you nodding at me or taking a note, I'm receiving from you these kind of nonverbal cues that you're getting it or you're confused. I'm noticing I can pay attention to sort of that visual. As a matter of fact, during the pandemic, because I'm a visual person, it was really hard for me because I could only see people's eyes. I was in the office, I was like, are you getting this? I can't tell. And so all of us learned that, right? That's why we reciprocally talk to one another while you're nodding at times. That's just something that's in the way that we operate. And when our kids are having online relationships, they're not receiving this skill, okay? Even when they're with their friends, they often still have their phone in the way. They're not really connected in the relationships that they had before. Friendships in general are more negotiable. They're more shallow. There's less community. And this, even though our kids are connected, creates more isolation online, in person. The asynchronous interactions that are void of social development, they don't see reactions in real time, they don't develop the parts of their brain that are expecting to get tuned up to conversations. This void also really makes conflict with our kids quite difficult because they don't know how to receive conflict in the same way, even from us, and they don't really know how to interpret conflict. Oftentimes, I notice just in my own office that kids will think a kid is always mad at them or mean to them in a way that feels so much more pervasive than it used to. It's not that bullying didn't happen, but the way that they see the world is so different because they're not in connection with people in a way that you and I have been in our lives. The second major harm is sleep deprivation. So the amount of sleep a 6th grader needs can vary slightly depending on individual factors, like their overall health and their activity level and their genetics. But the American Academy of Sleep Medicine indicates that the general recommended sleep duration for a kid in this age group, in the 6th grade age group, is between 9 and 12 hours of sleep. And that's laughable. And that's for optimal health and well-being. Sleep disturbances are greater for kids who are on social media and surfing the internet in bed. Sleep deprivation over time increases our kids' risk not only of depression and behavioral problems, but it contributes to poor focus. I always say to parents in the office when they come in and they're worried about ADHD, I remind them that lots of things look like poor focus. And the top thing that does is poor sleep. I mean, think about it when you were postpartum or when you had your kids. You can't get anything done when you're exhausted. And so many of our kids aren't already getting adequate sleep because they're stressed out about how much homework they have here. And then on top of it, if our limits around nighttime aren't firm, they can be surfing or navigating the digital landscape at night, which directly impacts their success in the classroom. And I have absolutely no doubt this is contributing to the increase in mental illness in our country. Zero doubt. And then, it's also important for us to acknowledge that this takes a toll on our kids' ability to think, right? They're constantly distracted all the time. Think about when you have your kids like, Mom, Dad, like you can't get anything done. The average kid is getting 192 notifications a day on the social media platforms from the top social and communication apps. That's interrupted, not 100. So when you ask me, do I think that I should let my kids have their phones in their rooms when they're doing homework? I don't know the answer to that, but I want you to recognize that that's the interruption that's happening that's affecting their capacity to learn. I mean, not all 192 during that time, but and studies show that even just having the phone in the space impacts it, not even doing anything with it. And then, we have to talk about addiction. I mean, I was married to an addict. I can't help but echo Hate's concerns about the dopamine response that kids get from phones. And you will notice when you create boundaries in your homes, just like drugs, if your kids have been on social media significantly or any device, they will withdraw. They often will experience anxiety, irritability, insomnia, or feelings of general unwellness and unease. And it's critical that you know that ahead of time and you expect it, because nothing has gone wrong. We get so mad at our kids for staying on their devices, but we're literally like giving them a digital opioid every day and then wondering why they can't get off the crack. It's not fair to our kids to have those expectations of of themselves, and it certainly is something that many of us struggle with, and it's critical that we have compassion for how difficult it is for them. This is really, of course, a collective social addiction. And if we see it as thus, we can partner with our kids. It's me and my kid against the phone and the social media, not us as parents against our kids and their phones. And that partnership can sometimes lead to really interesting and compelling conversations about what's right for your family, what's right for your kid, and more importantly, to be able to communicate your values as a family in a way that feels right for you. So let's talk about boundaries for a second in the last part of my comments, and then of course I'm delighted to take any questions. If I can answer them, I will. Boundaries can feel really sticky around social media. They can be sticky with teenagers overall, to be honest with you. We have so much doubt around this particular boundary, though. I get asked all the time. It feels really, really challenging. We have so much concern about how our kids are going to feel about our boundaries, right? They're going to feel sad. They're going to feel isolated. They're going to feel upset. And if you already have a child, if you're still navigating the decision around doing social media with your kids, I will tell you this. If you already have a child that fights you on every boundary, has a hard time staying focused, or has a challenging time managing their time, social media will make this worse exponentially. If those are skills that your kids don't have at all, I would strongly encourage you to avoid any of this until you get more momentum in those spaces. So let me just be super clear for everybody on what a boundary is so that we're on the same page, because not everybody thinks about it the way that I do or thinks about it in the way that is intended as the definition. A boundary is what you are going to do when your kid does what they're going to do. Okay? So when I say to my son he needs to come home at midnight, and if he doesn't come home by midnight or call me before and let me know he's going to be late, I am not going to let him go out the next night. But I don't call him and check in on him and remind him he needs to get home on time. I don't get mad at him if he doesn't do it. I know what my boundary is going to be, and then he can get mad at himself about not making that plan. He walks in late, and I say, "You're late," and he says, "Oh, I had to take someone home." And I go, "Did you call?" Because that was the rule. And he says, "No," and I go, "Great, I'll take the keys." That's the end. We don't have to talk about it. We don't have drama about it. Boundaries are what you're going to do. It has nothing to do with whether your kid is going to ask you or beg you or complain about it. You want to be super clear when you're creating boundaries for your kids that your children understand what your role is in that. And we're not waiting for them to not make a mistake, because they're kids and they're going to make 1,000 mistakes and press up against all the boundaries. That's their job, okay? So I want to point out that boundaries are actually quite easy when you like your why. Okay, for me, the evening boundary around keeping my kids' phones out of their rooms was very hard. As a matter of fact, this is probably one of my biggest parenting regrets, although my kids were younger when all this was happening, so it wasn't as high of a cost. But my phone was in my room at night, and so I really liked my why, except I didn't really like it for me, and therefore I believed their story when they needed it for their alarm or whatever narrative they had on the day. But if you think about it, you do have boundaries with your kids that you love. If your sixth graders came home and said, "I had a tough day, can I have a shot of vodka?" You would be like, "I'm sorry, what?" That's a no. And they're like, "Well, someone else's kid said that they do a little glass of wine at the end of the day, it calms them down." You would like never be having the day where you're like, "I don't know what to do. I mean, all the other kids are doing it." You would never have that day, right? And you do the same thing for seatbelts. Your kids say they don't want to wear their seatbelt. You're like, "Well, just sit right here. I don't want to get arrested, and it's the law." So one of the reasons boundaries feel so tough with social media is that you just aren't invested in your why. And your whys are all going to be different. It's okay, right? Maybe your value is connection and you want your kids to learn that we don't sit at the table and, sit on social media. But that should be for your whole family. Are you showing up in that way? And so I want you to think about why you want to have a boundary for your kids. It will make it much easier for you to be committed to it. You think about all the rules we have in society that are age-based. You can't see a PG-13 movie unless you're 13. You can't drive unless you're 16. You can't vote unless you're 18. You can't drink until you're 21. There are no rules on the online space. As soon as you can use a web browser, you have access to everything. You just have to say you're 18. We have to make the rules ourselves. Nobody's coming. There's not. Maybe they will at some point. But it's going to take a lot more data and a lot more, the way our government's working right now, it's going to be a long time. So we have to make them themselves. And you are going to have, like every other value in your home, different rules for different kids and from different families. Parents often tell me, especially in kids who I talk to who are older, like 9th grade, 10th grade, the ship has sailed. It's too late for me to make a boundary. But I want you to know that we have been making the world safer for kids when we knew better as long as things have been happening. We used to not wear bicycle helmets. We used to, smoke. We used to have kids who didn't wear seatbelts. And I sat in the back of my station wagon for 12-hour trips, crisscross applesauce. So, we have different, it's okay for the rules to change. Our kids don't like that. And if you have a certain set of rules after this talk, if you're thinking through it, or you change your mind in a year, you're allowed as a parent when you know better to do better. And I certainly would have made some different changes based on what I know now if my kids were still in my house. So one of the things that I think is really obvious is that trust and communication in our kids is really important. If this isn't a strength in your relationship with your kids right now, an iPhone will make it worse. Any Android phone will make it worse. The truth is that your kids are actually better at tech than you, for most of you, unless you're in tech. But you're really good at judgment and responsibility and executive functioning, and both of you can contribute to the dynamic you have at home. Most kids forever, most human beings forever, don't like to be controlled. And we always try and control what we don't trust. And so when you're coming from a place of control in social media instead of collaboration, and to be clear, I don't mean it's a democracy. You still get to be the leader. But in terms of collaborating with your kids to better understand what it's like for them in this world that you did not have, you're more likely to get them on board. The truth is that a lot of kids, if you ask them, also don't love social media. It is hard for them to get off of them. They are feeling pressure. A lot of parts of it aren't amazing for them. And so if you can come from a place when you're working through your own boundaries from curiosity instead of judgment, you're more likely to have a meaningful conversation with your kids. Talk about your kids. Talk to your kids, about what their online experiences are about. Join them, ask them what their friends are. One of my favorite things to do when I didn't want to put my kids on the spot is just to ask, do you have friends that are looking at porn, or do you have friends that have told you about that? When we ask our kids indirectly about things that their friends are doing, and don't ask specifics, who? I gotta tell their mom, but just what's it like being a teen when everybody can get online? It creates this space that they don't have to admit it's them, but they're able to discuss the parts that are tricky. And frankly, sometimes that is actually happening where they really want to tell a grown-up where there's a problem, where there's something going on, and us opening that window or that door allows them to feel safe to do so. I think we talked about teaching, digital literacy. One thing that I was just talking to a mom that I was coaching before I came over here today is that, we spend a lot of time explaining things to kids, lecturing them on all the things so that they don't do the wrong thing. And I think I already talked about giving them a lecture on what to do instead of not to do. But I want you to understand that one of the reasons that we teach people to drive the way we do is because giving someone a booklet and telling them how to drive in a booklet is very different than putting them in the environment and teaching them how to navigate a car, okay? We would never just be like, well, you finished that book, you got an A on the test, good luck, see ya. We don't do that, right? We get in the car with them, and then the experiences that they read about they do in real time, which allows them to learn the skill more effectively. And the online space is a lot like that. We can tell our kids all the things not to do, but they're going to get on YouTube, like my daughter did, and look up belly dancing for a project and find porn. And they're going to be in situations that none of us can anticipate or experience. And so when we restrict social media completely from our kids, although I do think that there is certainly there's plenty of compelling evidence that waiting much longer than we used to is better, we also cheat them out of the ability to navigate the space while they're still in our homes, and we can help them understand it. And if we're always trying to catch them doing it wrong, or punish them for doing it, or shame them from doing it, they don't get the chance to figure out how to navigate it in a more effective way. Someone asked me, can teens understand the dangers of social media to their development and mental health? Yes and no. You can explain it, but they don't see it the same way you do because they don't have a frontal lobe. They're not thinking about the risks. I mean, how many kids I told to wear a condom in my office who end up with chlamydia? I mean, I could just shoot myself. It's like they just don't think about it going, in the long game. So it does make sense to explain the science behind social media and overuse, but not to get them to agree. It's not critical that they agree with you. It's appropriate that you educate them, but like any topic, most teens just think they know everything. And so they're unlikely to be like, I appreciate that perspective. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to give that some thought. That's not typical, okay? I will say that if you have limits on your own child that you're crazy consistent about, it's also useful for you to know from a digital literacy standpoint that when other children don't, your kid could sometimes be spending time, especially when they're in high school, wandering around looking at a bunch of kids who are on their phones, right? So it is kind of on us to communicate as a community, and that's the best thing about this school, right, is that as a community we all kind of collectively work to agree on certain values that we have around what our kids are exposed to during the day. But it is challenging for our kids who really want to abide by your rules or even think that they make sense to them to have other children in their landscape that don't have that same regulation. One of you said, I've heard an idea of a contract that's signed between parents and the school and the child so the whole community is on the same page. Is this something you've heard of? Yes, and I love it. So when it comes to monitoring, there really isn't a right to this, okay? I like to think of it as like police speeding. So you know the police that are out there, you know that there's a sign, you know at any point you probably could get caught. You're careful because you know that there's sporadic checking from time to time. To me, that's the best way to monitor your kids. And the reason that I feel compelled to say that is that our long game for our kids is that they have developed their own inner compass, right? That they make a decision about what the right thing is to do. They're not doing it because they're going to get in trouble or get caught, right? We want them to start to develop their own ability and capacity to sort of self-regulate. And so when they're thinking I could get caught, or someone might be checking from time to time, that internally, ideally, will motivate them to think about what they put on, what they text or what they put out into the universe. But naturally, as I indicated earlier, there's a ton of opportunities for kids to over or underestimate the power of some of the things they say and do. And so us checking from time to time can get that information. Josette and I have a son that's the same age, and they were once on an Instagram feed together that I didn't know about. It was like an Instagram, whatever they call it, Finsta, or whatever it was. And so, but Josette was on it and I wasn't. And we were running at the time. And she asked me a question about something that one of the boys had said. It wasn't either of our kids, but one of the boys had said something that was making fun of a marginalized group in a way that wasn't consistent with how either one of us raised our families. And so I went up to my son and I said, you want to tell me a little bit about the Instagram account that you have that's the one that's not the one I know about? And he said, right in the moment, I didn't say anything wrong. And at that point, instead of getting mad at him for having a fake account, which I certainly could have been and would have been appropriate, I recognized that he didn't have the capacity to stand up for something that he believed was wrong. And I had the opportunity to explain to him in that moment that you don't get extra credit for not saying something, right? It's like, I'm proud of you for not being that person. And let's just be clear, it is really important that you are the person that says the opposite in those moments. And then I could ask, why was that hard for you? Why was that challenging for you to do that? Because to be honest, in their age group, it would have been really tricky for him to say, this isn't right, we shouldn't talk about blank people like that. He doesn't have that skill yet, and I want him to build the skill. So when we're really crushing boundaries, trying to be on top of our kids all the time, and we don't allow them to make little mistakes along the way, we really miss the invitation to figure out where parts of their childhood is hard for them, where they're vulnerable, where we want them to show up in a way that is consistent with who we're raising. And that's going to be different for all of us. But I certainly want to raise a son who's not afraid to say we don't do that, and he has to practice that. The only way he's going to practice it is to be in these moments. That was verbose, but I just have to say that. Okay, so my personal thought is that you don't have to really decide what your boundaries are right this second. It's more important that you're clear on what your intention is for checking, okay? Your intention is more important than what you do. Why? Because if you have a higher priority to teach your kids safety, you're going to show up in that relationship different than if your higher priority is to judge them or catch them making a mistake. So it doesn't matter so much. If you're curious as opposed to judgmental, your interaction will be different. I'm wondering why this was hard for you. I'm noticing that you did X, Y, and Z. Let's talk about it. It's very different than, I cannot believe that you did that. It shuts them down. It creates a space of disconnection. It doesn't make your kids want to tell you the truth. And they need your judgment during these moments, because if they don't get yours, they're going to look on TikTok or ask their friend. And those are the people who may not have the same values as you. So how do we, this is my least favorite question. I'm going to give it to Nikki. So how do we monitor screen time when they need to be on the phone for study? Okay, my child claims that they need their phone for group study. So I'll just give you some things to think about. Number one, I think the most important thing to pay attention to first is that true? So really better understanding, because the truth is that there aren't a ton of group projects that have to be done on the regular. Like, a lot of our kids are checking their work. And by the way, we did that. I can remember calling my friends on the phone when I was in school and asking if I forgot something or a paper. Like, it's not uncommon, but is it really critical that they have it in that moment, or is it a group project? Are they getting their work done? So how long is being on social media or their distractions impacting how long it's taking them to get their work completed? And then, one of the things that I think about as a skill our kids aren't building when they are checking with their friends during that time is they're missing out on the capacity to develop their own critical thinking skills, right? If it's easy to check with your friend who's right there, which may not be something that's allowed at Carey Academy, they're not really taking the time to critically think about a topic that might be important for their understanding of what they're learning. Yeah.
So you say that, like, with the phone, but if they don't have a phone, they have a computer.
And the Teams and whatnot.
And they have Teams,
Yeah.
and they have YouTube. And
Yeah.
how do I monitor, like, I can't take the computer away because that's where the homework is.
That's correct. The only real option that I can think of if you have it, because again, the goal is that they self-regulate, right? Like, sometimes when I'm doing my own charts when I was a physician, I'd be sometimes on Facebook, sometimes I'd be checking. Like, it's a compelling pull all the time.
Oh, yeah.
It's really hard for all of us.
Sure.
Sometimes I was talking to another CA parent recently, and having your kid as a boundary, if they really are stuck with that, doing their homework out in a room where everybody can see them can be very helpful, just to keep them accountable, not to get them in trouble, but I'd really like you to have the opportunity to do your homework in your room because it's quieter, but I can't trust that you're going to constantly be navigating on Teams. So I want to be able to be where I can just spot check from time to time, not to be in charge of their homework, but just to hold them accountable to sort of trying to get off of it. I don't know the details of what Carey Academy does anymore when it comes to sort of how they do Teams, but many parents have told me that Teams is an obstacle to them keeping their kids off of connecting with their friends. And I don't disagree, it's a problem. Sadly, it's not going to go away because there's always going to be a pull, but I would use your kids' ability to get work done as one of the metrics. The good thing about CA is that there is so much work, and there's for many of the kids, and then they also are typically engaged in other activities, sometimes too many in my opinion, but they really do have less time to get their work done, and that sometimes does work in our favor at this particular school. If I was giving this talk somewhere else, it might not be the case. But yeah.
We don't have phones during, like one of my kids doesn't have a phone at all. But we did, because I've got social butterflies at home. So this is just not even realistic to expect my children not to be on social media. So they have to be in an area close to where I am, and it's like you said, it's not to get them in trouble, it's that it is an addiction. They're not even capable of not going on Teams if somebody pings them or whatever. And so it's not a shame thing, it's just so that they are safe. They need to be in a space that's where I am or where somebody is. And then the other thing is, one of the teachers suggested that she prints out the material for one of my children rather than having the homework online, if it comes to that. And I know it's paper, but with all the waste, paper is at least recyclable, but they are willing to print out some of the homework if it becomes too much to be online with computer use.
Yeah.
There are also resources to block Teams for.
There are, yes. I mean, there's certainly a
certain
ton.
times during the evening.
That's right.
It's not, but it's not just Teams, it's like, like, there's like YouTube, you just open up a browser and they can watch YouTube
That's
for hours, and so I'm not, I mean, my child already does his homework in the kitchen, and I'm there, but I'm making dinner, and I've got another child, and I've got a dog, and I've got a husband that's always talking to me.
You can't just stand there. God forbid.
That's for another day. But,
Different dog.
but it's like, he's doing his math, and then all of a sudden he's looking at ESPN, he's doing his math, and he's looking at, how to do Minecraft, a Minecraft video. Like, it's all lovely stuff, but how do I, like...
You don't. I mean, it just really is a skill that has to be built, and frankly, we're not always modeling the behavior ourselves, to be perfectly honest with you. Do you photograph everything you eat? Are you guys on your screens when you're paying attention to what you need to do? I think that adults can have a hard time putting out their own devices on, and our kids pick up on sort of how our environment is at home. And, this isn't happening so much here, but in lots of communities, parents are resisting school rules for shutting down social media and for tech in schools because it interrupts their convenience, right? We want our kids to be available to us, and we want to pick them up, and we need to know where they're going to be. The other thing that I think is an interesting thing to think about as well is that, and this is not in the context of social media, but I'll just bring it up because we're talking about is, do you have your kids tracked all the time, and how does that escalate your anxiety as parents? How does that create kind of this need for connection all the time that makes it more likely that your kid is going to need to be tethered to their phone? I think a lot of us just sort of have gotten the habit of putting our kids on Life 360 or Face or whatever our phone algorithm allows, and how much are we doing that in an effort, like for my son, I wanted him on Life 360 so he wouldn't have to answer the phone when I wanted to know where he was. But it wasn't the way that I was always checking to see where he was to be afraid. And so I think that's a slippery slope with some of those tracking devices as well, because it really forces our kids to have their phones right near us. Why didn't you call me? I just tried to get up with you, and I see that you're at Perry Academy. Call me back. It really does accidentally tether our kids to their devices even more. So I think it's better to make rules with your kids together. I would get input from your children on what seems realistic. I don't mean like when to start social media, which I think should happen after middle school, but getting input and then deciding, taking their input, hearing what their life is like, what the concerns are, and then making a decision yourself. Someone asked me if I thought boundaries should be decided together, and I think that there's not a right way to do it. You're certainly, as a parent, have every right to sort of decide how the rules are going to be in your home. But when we're opening a conversation to better understand what our kids are experiencing, we sometimes may change our boundary or our rule based on new information. And if we're always opening the conversation, we're more likely to create connection, which allows our kids to appreciate our rules in a different way. I do feel really strongly that limiting screens before bed is really important to the extent with which you can. I'm sure that's not news to any of you. I would not have phones in the room ever for my kids at this age. If I could have gone back, I would.
Or tablets.
Or any of it. Set a screen-free routine to your child, like reading or listening to a podcast, to help them settle in at night. And for older kids who might be doing their homework late, which will get worse when your kids start into high school, I'm sure, helping them find a routine that calms down their brain before bedtime can really go a long way in helping their sleep, which we've already talked about is a huge impact to their emotional regulation. One of you indicated that turning off notifications is really helpful, and the technology is going to get better and better with that, so you can look forward to that in the life of your kids as they get into late adolescence. Apple has a screen time feature, Google's Family Link does it, and then, some kids like to use their phone for background music or noise. I would just recommend not buying into that whole narrative. I'd get them an alarm clock and a white noise machine and be done with it, if it was me. And then having them turn their notifications off if that's not an option or something that you agree about. And then I think I already alluded to this, like we want to be working towards teaching our kids to develop the capacity to self-regulate themselves. These are some really good films, if you've not seen them, that offer valuable insights into social media and the challenges associated with it. Childhood 2.0 particularly is really compelling. They're also a little bit uncomfortable. And if you're gonna watch, especially Screenagers or Childhood 2.0, you may wanna watch them first and then just make sure, but I think it creates a lot of good conversation with kids because the theoreticals that we give them in terms of risk sometimes are more potent when they see it in video form. Watching them together can spark really good conversations among kids as well. And if you need me, this is where you can find me. Any of you can take a picture or screenshot my email. I do work with parents one-on-one for all sorts of issues, not just for screens. As a matter of fact, this isn't my shtick, although I do talk about it a lot when it comes to boundary setting when I talk to teenagers. And I know we're hitting the end of the hour, but if you have any questions, if I can't answer them, I'd be delighted to. I appreciate all of you being here today. I hope this was helpful to some extent.